Zach, we are back and we are talking dynasty moves to make. There are 6 weeks left in your fantasy football season, including your playoffs. The season has come and gone far too quickly, but this video is here to stay for at least a little bit. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, please leave a like, comment down below. If you need help making those moves in your dynasty leagues, there's a couple ways you can do it. You can head over to patreon.com/dynasty rewind. Get in that Discord server for a free 7-day trial, or backed by popular demand, our holiday special for roster reviews, 25% off until Christmas Eve. Y'all can enjoy that. Get ahead in the waiting line for roster reviews heading into the offseason. It's going to be very hectic. Last year, we did somewhere around 120 roster reviews. So get in the line before it's too long. That deal's there to stay for at least a little bit. But with all that said, all the promo in the book, Zach, let's get to the content that people came for. The first question I have for you: trade deadlines are looming. Some may have actually come and gone already. I don't know. My first bit of advice with trade deadlines is to remove them, but that is not a conversation we're going to get into too much today, if not, ideally not at all. But Zach, what's a trade deadline move you're making? Plus, feel free to throw out any advice for just in general how to proceed during trade deadlines. Zach, what do you got for us?
Yeah, so for me, Bob, here, what I'm really going to hyper focus on is your more competitive teams. I think if you're a rebuilding team at this point, it's obvious what you should be doing. You should be gathering draft picks. You should be trading for players that are hurt. You should be trading for players that you think can maybe break out next season. Those things are pretty obvious. But what I'm going to target here is the more competitive teams. And at this point, most of my teams and my moves are done for the most part. The big moves, the league shaking, the moves that really move the needle, those are done for the most part. So what I'm looking to do is really complement my team here, find a good flex player that we still have a good amount of teams on bye coming up the next few weeks, by the way. Week 12 and week 14, I think, are pretty significant bye weeks. I believe there's still a double-digit amount of NFL teams that haven't gone on a bye yet. And then, of course, your fantasy playoffs. So I'm looking at remaining schedules, who's got a good schedule, and what is the price that it's going to cost me. So somebody I'm looking to acquire at this point is Raiders wide receiver Jacoby Myers, who has been the de facto wide receiver one since the Davante Adams trade. In the 3 games that he's played since the Davante Adams trade, he's been targeted 24 times. So that's 8 targets a game. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a player that I can comfortably insert into my lineup and feel safe and secure that I'm going to get close to double-digit points. And really what I'm trying to do here is buy a player that's not too expensive to get. He's a 28-year-old wide receiver. He's not on a sexy team. He's, by proxy, just a player that's getting targets because there is nobody else there right now outside of Brock Bowers. So he's been somebody that I've really been honing in on the last week or two to try and buy in some of my leagues, especially if he's on some of these more non-competitive teams. But if you look, Bob, at the rest of his remaining schedule, which is really another reason why I was targeting Jacoby Myers, the Raiders from weeks 14 to week 17, the Raiders have the easiest wide receiver strength of schedule for those 4 weeks. The teams that he plays, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, their last game, they didn't play this last week, they had a bye, but their last game, they gave up 353 passing yards and 2 touchdowns to the 49ers. He has the Falcons. They just gave up 307 yards and 4 touchdowns to Bo Nix. The Jaguars, they just gave up 449 passing yards and 4 touchdowns to Jared Goff and Hendon Hooker. And the Saints, they just gave up 395 passing yards and 2 touchdowns to Jameis Winston and the Saints. Those are his 4 opponents the last week of the fantasy season and your fantasy playoffs. Those are teams that are seemingly easy to throw on. Now, look, Brock Bowers is there, but there's not much else there in terms of attention to where the quarterbacks are going to go, So that's what I want. And I looked on Dynasty Daddy for some trades. You see a lot of second-round picks. You see Jalen Coker in a third-round pick. And then one trade that I saw that was pretty interesting was Jacoby Myers straight up for Terry McLaurin. I don't think that this matches up value-wise very evenly. However, for the rest of the season, I would rather have Jacoby Myers over Terry McLaurin. That may be controversial, but just looking at the opponents they play, I mean, you look at Jacoby Myers' rest of schedule after these next 2 weeks, it's all green. And that's a player that I want to be putting into my lineup because I feel good that even if the Raiders are not winning that game, they are going to be able to throw the ball. So Jacoby Myers, somebody I'm looking to buy. It's not too expensive, and I feel really good about his matchups the rest of the season, Bob.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you on the Jacoby Myers buy, solely on the fact of great matchups. As you noted, he's one of the only targets there. They aren't passing anybody out of the backfield for any significant amount of work. And then on top of that, I'm kind of with you on preferring him over McLaurin rest of the season. McLaurin also has a bye week coming up. He's one of the tough bye weeks that people are going to have to be dealing with coming up. So that's one game that's a guaranteed 0 from Terry McLaurin by comparison to Jacoby Myers. So it's just one more week. You have more points in your lineup. I'm actually here for it. And just real quick, I want to run through just something you should be doing if you're a rebuilding team. Zach, you touched on it. I know it's obvious for a lot of people who've been around the block, who've done a rebuild before, but just to kind of touch base, sell any of your aging, declining assets, anything that a competitive team would be very interested in. Take a look at the competitive teams in your league, see who needs a wide receiver, see who needs a Terry McLaurin, a Mike Evans, all these aging vets that are just really declining in value. Because if you haven't been into an offseason before with a rebuilding team, even if you have, a great reminder is that the second the season shuts off, the second those players are done putting points in your lineup and it's all about rookies and the rookie draft, say goodbye to their value. Their value will tank. Anybody who's over the age of 26, it's almost a guarantee their value is just going to go to heck in a handbasket. So that's one thing, to just try to stockpile picks as much as you can, or even not always picks. Picks aren't always the answer. Sometimes trading for players that are injured, like you mentioned, Zach, as well. Players who have shown some promise that are a little younger, things like that. Absolutely 100% things to do as you proceed to your fantasy football trade deadlines.
For the majority of this point of the season, we're at week 12. I feel like the big move should be done. And if you're a rebuilding team, you should just be trying to clean house. You have older players that you don't think are going to have value after the season. Those are players you should try to get whatever you can, even if you can just get a bump in an early fourth for X player and a late fourth. These are things you should try to do to maximize every single piece on your team.
And with that said, we'll move on into the next segment here, and we'll talk what is the move to make with Anthony Richardson back in the starting saddle immediately after them saying Joe Flacco is going to start the rest of the year. Anthony Richardson back in. Are we back in on Anthony Richardson? Some takeaways from the previous game. Managed his first full game in 2024, throwing for over 50% completion percentage. Yippee, let's go. No interceptions, but we did lose a fumble. Can't keep it too clean, And just some recent trades for reference before we get into any talking points, because at the end of the day, this is a value game. And we don't hate players, we hate values. But Anthony Richardson for Brandon Ayuk, Anthony Richardson for a 2026 first-round pick, Anthony Richardson for a 2025 first-round pick, straight up Anthony Richardson for Bo Nix. These all happened today. As of before recording, Monday morning, we're recording at 10 a.m., 10 a.m. for me, 11 a.m. for Zack. A little early for us normally, but these have all happened today after Bo Nix's big game, after Anthony Richardson had a nice 3-touchdown game. And looking at some of the other trades I'll discuss too once we kind of get into this, there's not many trades I wouldn't mimic that have been completed today on Dynasty Daddy, moving off of Anthony Richardson. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you got on Anthony Richardson? Are you back in?
No, as somebody who's not a riskier dynasty player, I want off this sinking ship as soon as possible. I was actually a big fan of him getting to just take a step back and just watch and learn and grow. And to me, when I thought about that, that was not a 2-week sample size. And that ended up being what it was. And look, you could talk all about, he needs reps and he needs this. Yeah, but he also needs to learn other things, like how to be a professional and how to be a leader of men, because you are the quarterback of the team. It's the most important position in all of sports. And I didn't think that was going to happen over a 2-week stretch. And I still don't believe that happened over a 2-week stretch. I don't care what the coaching staff is trying to sell me. That's never happened. You've never had a quarterback sit for only 2 weeks and be incrementally better. And I'm a big fan, and this, Bob, of quarterbacks just sitting in general. I was able to get myself out of an Anthony Richardson trade, or the Anthony Richardson situation in a league here. Let me run this trade by you. I acquired Matthew Stafford, TJ Hawkinson, and a 25 fourth for Anthony Richardson, Joe Flacco, and a 25 third-round pick.
I'm in on this deal. I'm a big Hawkinson fan. I like Matthew Stafford. Not somebody who's going to be here for a long time, but hey, we're here for a good time in the interim at least. You do lose the pick value there with the swap, but TJ Hawkinson is a solid locked-in tight end for a long term. Stafford is locked in as a starting quarterback as long as he's probably in the NFL. I don't see him getting benched anytime soon. So to get out on Anthony Richardson for at least one piece I like for the long term, I think is pretty fair value. So I'm good on this deal. For me, it's going to take a lot more than one game with actually throwing the ball competently with over 50% completion percentage. To me, take this as an opening of a new sell window, because evidenced by trades that are happening today, you can tell me all you want that nobody's buying Anthony Richardson for that anymore, and I'll just look you in the face and say you're dead wrong, because there are completed trades, Dynasty Daddy Football Trade Database. Go there, look at these completed trades, see what you can do to shop around some of these picks. And honestly, like, if I wasn't able to get such great pieces in return, looking at evidence again by these trades, maybe I'd consider holding just to see what happens. But some of these deals are absolute no-brainers. As I said at the top of the segment, it's a value game at the end of the day. I'm going to run a couple of these by you, Zach, because like I said, I don't think there's a single trade out here that I would not do moving off of Anthony Richardson at this point. So I've listed a good bunch here already. Would you pay Anthony Richardson and a second-round pick to go get Caleb Williams right now?
Yeah, if I could get off Anthony Richardson, I feel like the last person that's going to get replaced in Chicago is Caleb Williams at this point.
Sure, I agree. Anthony Richardson and David Njoku for Bo Nix. So we're adding a little bit onto Bo Nix. And honestly, I know that previous trade was Bo Nix straight up for Anthony Richardson. I would pay a little bit on top of Anthony Richardson. I would do David Njoku, but I'd want just a little bit back. Give me like a third-round pick back.
Yes.
And I'd call that pretty square.
I'd be fighting, scratching, and clawing my way to get something back on the end of that.
Yeah. And it's not a tight end premium league. So it's in this case at least. But I'm with you there. I'd like just a little bit more, but I don't want to be greedy either. I want out. And to get to Bo Nix, who's been, for the most part, pretty darn good his entire rookie year for the most part. Not mad about that at all. Plenty of first-round picks in 2025 straight up. This one's kind of interesting. Anthony Richardson for Dak Prescott straight up. What do you think about that one?
I do that. Dak's locked in for quite a good amount of time. He just re-signed a contract, and he's the highest-paid quarterback in the NFL. He's not going anywhere.
Anthony Richardson and a 2025 first-round pick for Kyler Murray.
So that's heavy. It's a lot to pay. I'd like to get something on the back end of that. I'm not sure that you can, but if you told me that Anthony Richardson at the end of the season, the Colts didn't win another game the rest of the season, and they were looking to make a move to another quarterback in the offseason, I wouldn't be surprised. Based off of what we've seen, I didn't see anything yesterday that I haven't already seen other than, he completed more than 50% of his passes. Okay, they barely beat a pretty bad football team in the Jets yesterday. So that's expensive, but if I get that security of Kyler Murray, who's looking really good with the Arizona Cardinals right now, and he's another player, he's not going anywhere.
Yes, Zach, I am with you as well. I would gladly move Anthony Richardson and the first to go get Kyler. It'd be awesome to get something back on the back end, even if it's a distant third, 26th third, or 27th third even, or some throw-in player. But, hey, man, we want that stability. That's what you talked about. So we will move right along. Speaking of stability or lack thereof, Zach, I have a question from you from our Discord. Again, another reason to hop in that Discord, patreon.com/rewind. Get in there for a free 7-day trial. Get some questions on this show sheet. Zach, are there any stream-worthy tight ends worth buying, or are we just sticking with the big-name guys, the old reliables that also have not been super reliable for the good part of this season? But, Zach, you got a couple here that you're interested in. Tell me what you think. Tell me why you're buying. And I'll pull some values up. I know these guys are cheap because I've already looked ahead at the show sheet. What do you got for these guys?
Well, before I give these two names, there's one thing to say. There's nobody that's reliable at the tight end position anymore outside of Brock Bowers. There's nobody. Let me give you a good example. Yesterday, I had a league where I had TJ Hawkinson, David Njoku, and Taysom Hill. And surely I go, TJ Hawkinson had almost 10 targets last week. Let me throw him in my starting lineup. And it was the worst of the three tight ends, as he had 2 targets to Taysom Hill's 3 touchdowns. So speaking of Taysom Hill, that's somebody that you can absolutely stream. It doesn't cost you very much. In the last 4 weeks, he scored 80 fantasy points. I know he had 45 of them this week. It's still over 10 points a week the other 3 weeks. There's no Chris Olave. There's no Kendre Miller for the next 2 weeks. There's no Rashid Shaheed coming back. So there's not a lot of weapons there that would take away from Taysom Hill. So, I mean, you got to feel good starting Taysom Hill the next few weeks. Another name, Jonnu Smith, a top 10 tight end on the season right now. Last 6 games, he's averaging 6.5 targets a game and 6.8 fantasy points per game. Teams are daring Miami to throw him the ball. They are paying extra close attention to Tyreek Hill and to Jalen Waddle. And Jonnu Smith is the benefactor of that. Yesterday, with the game on the line, the Dolphins needed an ice the other team drive, and Jonnu Smith provided, I think it was a 50-yard touchdown.
I do have to fight you because I think Trey McBride is another name that absolutely deserves to be on the list of guys you can rely on.
Yeah. No, you're right. There's 1 or 2 names I'm sure I'm forgetting, but the point remains is that nobody's safe. Like, you could get a 0 from a tight end any week. You could get 45 points or 30 points from Jonnu Smith like you did. It's just the reality of the position at this point.
Yeah. It's been a rough year to stomach the production of tight ends because there has been very little consistency. And if you go outside the top 3 in fantasy points per game, George Kittle, Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, there's disappointments littering their schedule throughout. But like you said, some guys on hot streaks, Jonnu Smith, Taysom Hill especially. And the best part, again, we talked about it, don't hate players, hate values. The values on Taysom Hill, the absolute most expensive price I've seen for him, a 26-second or a 25-second straight up. Otherwise, it's 4 third-round picks, other players that were drafted in 3rd or 4th rounds. I mean, you're not paying much to go get these guys. Would you pay a 3rd-round pick for Taysom Hill to have him? You have nobody else at tight end to have him to stream the rest of the year. Would you pay a 3rd-round pick for him?
I'm a competitor, and that's a late 3rd-round pick. It's not something crazy. I would not do a 2nd-round pick. To me, it would take a 2nd-round pick to acquire Taysom Hill from another competing team. That's the only situation that makes sense. If Taysom Hill is on a rebuilding team, they're going to want to get those 50 points off. So I'm not paying a 2nd-round pick. I'll just threaten them to say, hey, you enjoy those points, and you enjoy ruining your draft pick for Taysom Hill.
And then looking at Jonnu Smith, some recent trades, similar stories. I think I'm probably a little less compelled to buy in on Jonnu Smith, but the price seems to be a little less, more consistently 3rd-round picks, 4th-round picks, solely because Jonnu Smith, at the end of the day, there's a lot of competition there for touches. There's the 2 wide receivers you mentioned, in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and also Devon Chan has been getting a ton of receiving work as well. So, while they're trying to take away those other downfield threats in Hill or Waddle, Jonnu Smith has that reign, but could easily get factored out of a game. And I just don't think Taysom Hill, who gets used in every facet of the game, rushing, receiving, heck, even throwing the ball, sometimes for interceptions, albeit. But yeah, I'd be interested. I thankfully have Trey McBride in a lot of places, so I'm not super concerned about my tight end position. But if he happens to get injured, God forbid, Taysom Hill is somebody I might be knocking on the door for, as much as I hate to have him on my roster because he is so just ungodly frustrating to have on your roster. But you talked about him before the season for, break glass in case of emergency. Here's Taysom Hill, and here we are again, somewhat accessible. You could probably do worse at your tight end position. And yeah, like you said, there's probably some other tight ends you could think about buying. David Njoku is a name that's somewhat interesting. Kate Otten until Mike Evans is back, or once that offense gets rolling again, who knows? But other than that, man, the tight end landscape is a wasteland right now. I mean, you're not getting the production we wanted out of Mark Andrews, Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, TJ Hawkinson's been kind of a slow burn coming back. So yeah, tight end just kind of sucks, man. At the end of the day, if you can find points in your tight end slot, just be happy and move along. Speaking of guys who produce like tight ends do, what is the move to make with Quentin Johnston? And the reference to tight ends, because he's very feast or famine. You're either getting a good chunk of points out of Quentin Johnston or you're not getting a whole heck of a lot. But what is the move to make with Quentin Johnston? Wide receiver, 37 points per game, 5 touchdowns on his 20 receptions on the season, averaging a whopping 4.1 targets per game. And now I believe this is actually coming into at least the touchdowns and receptions is coming into this week. I didn't have those stats added at the point of this video, or at the time of this video. But at the end of the day, are we buying back in on this bounce back season? Because he has had a better season. I could fully admit that, especially with this new offense that's a little more run heavy than it is pass heavy. It's been a better year, but when you're wide receiver 167, it's not that much harder to be better, which he certainly has been. But so are we buying in on this bounce back season, thinking things will get even better in year 3? That classic stereotypical year 3 breakout. You will hear that next offseason from somebody out there. I promise. Oh, it's his 3rd year. It's the breakout year for Quentin Johnston. But recent trades for reference, Quentin Johnston for a 25-second. I saw this 5 times in the 25 most recent trades for Quentin Johnston. That's a whopping 20% of trades going for a second-round pick. So it's pretty cut and dry. A second-round pick is probably the value of Quentin Johnston if you want to buy or sell him. But another deal, Quentin Johnston plus a 25 third for Sam Darnold. I know you've been a Darnold guy this season. Or Quentin Johnston for Jake Ferguson. I know you're a Jake Ferguson guy as well. But without Dak, a little bit of lackluster or Dak-luster, as you could say, either way. But Zach, what are your thoughts on Quentin Johnston? Are you in, out, buying, selling? Is this fool's gold or something better than that? I don't know what. But Zach, what are your thoughts here?
It's not a player I want to go out there and try to acquire. You were probably able to do it relatively affordably before the season. Now that he's had some boom games, people are going to have that hopium. And, something that you did right on the show sheet that I don't want to take credit for, but it is a good point, is the touchdown percentage right now is astronomical. And if you want a good example of that, look no further than last season's Sam Laporta, who we should have maybe been a little bit smarter about in the offseason. I don't remember any of us talking about, he had a lot of touchdowns, and that wasn't the main talking point around Sam Laporta. And so that's something we need to start paying attention to more. Like, what players are maybe going to be victim to having less touchdown opportunity. It's just not a player I'm interested in. This is not somebody I didn't like the college film, didn't like what I saw, was happy I had literally 0 shares of him on my 30-plus rosters in the offseason, and that is not going to change. It's just not a player I'm excited about or I'm interested in. I don't know what they do at wide receiver, but I don't think Quentin Johnston is the future for the Chargers. I could be wrong just because of he's in a friendly scenario, right? He's got a great quarterback, seems like a good offense, and he's cheap. I mean, all those things are check marks as to reasons why he would be there. I just would expect them to bring in somebody else in the offseason in terms of competent wide receivers, competent tight ends, in order to help Justin Herbert assimilate more to the new style of offense the Chargers want to run. So just not somebody I'm interested in acquiring whatsoever. The deals aren't terrible. I'm not saying for you to go out there, but as somebody, me, who's seen the film and watched him some of his rookie film, just not interested. Not somebody I want to go out there and really get. A lot of his touchdowns, too, by the way, are on broken plays. He did have a very nice touchdown on Sunday night, a very nice route run. The Bengals secondary is terrible, and 2 safeties went and covered the other guy, and so he was open. So a lot of his touchdowns are on broken plays. They're not like it's 3rd and goal on the 5-yard line, I need a touchdown. It's the 2 safeties went to cover this guy. Here's the Quentin Johnston open for 40 yards down the field. So, and credit to him, but at the same point, it's just not somebody I'm interested in acquiring on my fantasy football teams.
I am with you 100% on Quentin Johnston, but we got to have a little side discussion because it's worth talking about Sam Laporta here a little bit. And Noah, I want to shout out him. I'm not sure if he mentioned it specifically in a video that, hey, we should be a little cooler on Sam Laporta specifically for touchdowns, but I do remember him talking about it a little bit in the Discord, especially with the astronomical rise that Sam Laporta had. And here's the funny thing. So the reason why everybody was right, in my opinion, looking back in hindsight, on getting on Sam Laporta, he had 120 targets last year. And that's insane for a rookie tight end. It's insane for any tight end, honestly. Then he has 10 touchdowns as well to go along with that. That's good for an 8% touchdown rate, a little over 8% and some change touchdown rate. You look at this year, 32 targets, 3 touchdowns, which is a higher touchdown rate than he had last year. So the touchdown rate hasn't done anything for him. He's just not getting the targets. And why that is, there needs to be a whole deep dive on it. I haven't gotten into it with everything else going on during the season, but there needs to be a very deep dive on why Sam Laporta is just gone from this offense. I don't know if it's just, he hasn't, leveled himself up to get that much better this year, where defenses are a little more keyed into the guy, whatever the case is, but that's speculation for me at this point. But the touchdown rate really hasn't changed for Sam Laporta. It's actually better this year than it was last year. And that's, he's kind of in that wonky range of, it's such a small sample size now, but honestly, it's tough for me. You want to look at somebody else, though, that is a good example. Jordan Addison, somebody who had an astronomical touchdown percentage last year as well, touchdown rate. And how's that turned out for all the Jordan Addison truthers out there who just can't manage to agree with me that he's overvalued and overhyped? But as a fantasy producer, great football player. But back to Quentin Johnston, side note aside, and needless digs. But here we are. This is one of the easier see you laters for me that we've had on this show in recent memory, as in when it goes for Quentin Johnston. Recent memory goes back to when we were talking about people buying a Zamir White for a first-round pick or Zach Moss for a first-round pick coming into the season. Definitely want to get him off my roster. These prices are fine for me. If I can move him for a second, great. If I can move him for Jake Ferguson, very much in on that as well. Things I just can't ignore with Quentin Johnston. Just the god-awful rookie season. That's well noted. We were all there. We all saw it. It's well documented. That happened. You touched on it. The ridiculous touchdown rate. This is just not sustainable. And before you hit me with his targets can go up and then he'll make up for it with volume, Will Dissly is being targeted at a higher frequency than Quentin Johnston is. An NFL franchise, quarterback, offensive coordinator, and head coach are electing to target Will Dissly more than Quentin Johnston. I know we all love Will Dissly. As a human, as a player, he's fun. But that's all I need right there to know that I want out on Quentin Johnston. And why are they targeting Will Dissly more than Quentin Johnston? Maybe it's because Quentin Johnston still can't separate. Per player profiler, 37.3% route win rate, which is good for 93rd out of qualifying wide receivers, and a 14.5% route win rate versus man, which is good for 122nd. Get Quentin Johnston off of your rosters while you still can. This is another sell window, an easy sell window. Anything more than a second, anything that is a second that looks even relatively early, see you later. Bye-bye. Speaking of bye-bye, we will say bye-bye to that segment. We will talk about Chase Brown. What is the move to make with Chase Brown? Somebody we liked coming into the season. If I recall, Zach, I think you were in on him. If not in on him, less in on Zach Moss than I think consensus. But looking at Chase Brown, running back 7 since week 9, noting Zach Moss last played in week 8. But honestly, Chase Brown's been pretty good fantasy-wise throughout the entire season. He's been a nice gem to have. There's no denying that. But here we are again, looking at a running back with less than great draft capital who gets some work, subsequently rises through the ranks of fantasy production, fantasy value, dynasty value, etc. But again, this is something we have to put under a microscope and say, is this production here to stay with Chase Brown? I love the player, but in turn, is Chase Brown still worth buying? Is he an immediate sell, somebody to hold or avoid? Looking at recent trades that happened today for Chase Brown, moving off of or buying, however you want to look at it. Chase Brown for a 2026 first-round pick. Saw that twice. Chase Brown for Deebo Samuel. Chase Brown for Mike Evans. Chase Brown for a 25 third and 26 second. I love the construction of that trade. If you're paying that for just about any player, just sending the lower valued pick sooner and the higher valued pick later, just all about that. If you can work that into the schematics of your trade, by all means, do it. Chase Brown for 2 25 second-round picks. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Chase Brown. These values, are you in? Are you out? Is this another late round running back that we can rely on going forward, or is he somebody that we should maybe look to move on from? Situations are situational. We have to look at all these late round guys under a microscope. What do you think?
I think trying to buy Chase Brown right now would be a bad idea. If I have him, I'm very happy, and I do have quite a bit of Chase Brown because a lot of people this offseason had Zach Moss hopium. Zach Moss is the reason why I termed hopium, because I'm like, what is happening? Like, what is happening with Zach Moss? And the only word I can think of to describe this is people are believing in like fake hope. Zack Moss was the poster boy for the word hopium. Chase Brown right now, I think, is a hold. I don't want to sell Chase Brown. This is production via volume. I do think Khalil Herbert gets worked into this offense at some point, and whether or not Zack Moss comes back this season or they re-sign him next, or I don't know what the contract situation is with Zack Moss or Khalil Herbert type of situation. I think that he is benefiting from volume and he is taking advantage of that opportunity, and that is phenomenal. He looks good. He looks competent. They trust him. He's out there a lot of snaps for the Bengals right now. Yesterday, 83% of snaps. The week before, 87% of snaps. The week before, 80%. That's obviously with the loss of Zack Moss, but they did trade for Khalil Herbert, who I guess they haven't assimilated into that offense just yet. I am not actively trying to go out and buy Chase Brown for Deebo Samuel. Absolutely not. I will not recommend that to anyone. If you can go out there and get a level-headed trade done with somebody in one of your leagues, sure. But people are going to try to be capitalizing on the workload increase, as they should be, as any smart dynasty owner should do. But, sometimes a conversation can be had like, hey, listen, is that what you're expecting moving forward? Because I'm not, so I want to buy at, what his price should be. But no, I'm not buying for a first-round pick. I'm not buying for Deebo Samuel. I'm not buying for Mike Evans. A 25 third and a 26 second. Okay, that's I think I can stomach that. I'm not doing 2 seconds. I won't do that. So I think you have to be realistic in your expectations. It's a big thing that I talk about a lot, Bob, is managing your expectations. You're buying this player, but at some point, somebody else is going to be a part of that backfield, and especially moving forward into 2025 or whatever it is. I think Chase Brown could be the lead back, but he is not going to be Kyren Williams featured in that offense. I think he will be the 1A in the backfield, and as he should be, because at some point, if you continue this kind of workload, Chase Brown is not, I think he's 5'10",
5'9", 215.
Yeah, so I mean, he's got the weight, but the size is a little bit small. So he's not somebody I want to have 25 touches a game, which is what he's averaging. I mean, he's being hyper targeted in this offense. It's an offense that is also benefiting from a terrible defense where they're having to play catch up in a lot of games or score more points than their defense is allowing. So you have to have some realistic expectations when buying Chase Brown. And I think that's a good disclaimer for us to put, because it's not somebody that I want to go out there and pay these absorbent prices for, when I think you might be able to get him in the offseason, when Zack Moss has come back or Khalil Herbert was assimilated into that offense, and you might be able to get a better deal done. But if you're trying to buy for the stretch run, sure, but buy knowing that at some point somebody else is going to get worked into this offense.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Zach. And part of this, I really struggle with Chase Brown in general, if I'm being totally honest, because really like this college tape, was one of my favorite running backs in his respective draft class. And he's someone I liked as a sleeper coming into the season, and I figured he would get a bulk of the workload in the offense. But this production is coming to fruition, and that's nice to see. However, it's very tough for me to sit here and say I'm expecting this sort of production long term, because you touched on it beautifully. It's volume right now, which is not bad. Volume is something we've, but in general, sometimes has a negative connotation. But like, if you're getting volume, that means an NFL franchise trusts you, an offensive coordinator, head coach trust you enough to give you the ball, which is super important. So there's something there, but looking at what he's done compared to the rest of the NFL running backs, he pretty much shakes out as a middle of the pack running back. And essentially there's just no area where he sticks out. He's just, to me, he's kind of replaceable and probably isn't in line for the bulk of the touches in the long term. He's replaceable to me, but does that mean he gets replaced entirely? Does he get worked into this system in a much smaller workload, like a 10 to 15 touch workload? That can still be valuable, but again, you have to put the right expectation on that player then, and not have, expect a 27 touch performance that goes for 120 yards. I think, to me, and I'm glad you brought up Kyren Williams, because to me, he feels a lot more like a Tyler Algier than a Kyren Williams. Somebody who, if this is the last guy they're down to, they're going to give him work. They can trust him. He's going to get work and be good, but he's not somebody that's going to be a long-term consistent feature. And we talked about it ad nauseum. One of the reasons we felt so good about Kyren Williams sustaining his production is that when you stacked him up against the rest of the NFL, he was top 3 to 10 in just about every category that mattered. Touchdowns, rushing efficiencies, etc. It's just not the case with Chase Brown. And that's not bad. Again, we just have to have that realistic expectation. But nonetheless, we still have 6 weeks of fantasy football ahead of us before any change is going to be made. You noted that they brought in Khalil Herbert. We expect him to get some work at some point. That hasn't happened yet, but I still think it's probably Chase Brown's backfield to really lose. And it's not like we've seen any elite numbers out of Khalil Herbert that make us think like, wow, he's just going to absolutely destroy Chase Brown in a straight up competition. Chase Brown has the benefit of knowing that offense that bit better, already has trust with the coaching staff, etc. So with all that said, I'm happy to hold him and ride him out through a playoff run if I have him, or possibly pay a single mid to late second to go acquire him, because we've learned year after year after year, when you get into that mid-late part of the second, it's just don't draft guys that suck territory more than anything else. But I'd also really be interested in using him to tier up to somebody at the position and just a tier up deal. Just pile a first onto Chase Brown and go get a top tier running back, or even a second to just get somebody with a little more security, whatever the case is. And if I'm in a rebuild, I'm definitely seeking out some of these values to possibly move off of him in the season while his value is still high, because like with any other aging vet, the second the season ticks over, it's kind of a stopwatch to when is Chase Brown going to get replaced. And all we've heard about this 2025 draft class is that the rookie running backs are studs. They're all going to be so good. And the second we get these hype films coming out about these guys who are declaring, the clock starts ticking for who's going to put Ash and Jeanty to the Bengals in round 1, because they'll probably be in a position to draft them with how their record's going. And the Bengals can't buy a win. And I'm not a Bengals hater by any stretch of the imagination. I love Joe Burrow, love Jamar Chase. I like T. Higgins when he's healthy. And I like Chase Brown. I'm a pseudo Bengals fan practically. But this team is just Chase Brown is tough to stomach holding on to for anything long term. So I'd look to move off.